What's up gamers, Aaron Shack here with another Marvel's Avengers build video. This one is for the mighty Thor. Alright, let's take a look at mighty Thor's skill tree. First, on the primary skill tree, we have her light attack, Earth's Finest. This is a really great combo. You're just pressing square or X 4 times to perform a series of light attacks. Now, she's going to have a lot of moves that are very similar to Thor, aka Odin's son, but this one is very different. You notice here that she's sort of throwing the hammer, kind of a mid-range throw, you know? It's fairly close, but it's not quite as long as you would throw it if you were just doing a ranged attack. But she's obviously not keeping the hammer in her hands either. So it's a really great combo finisher that you can do decent damage with. You can stun enemies. And you can kind of deal with enemies that are just slightly out of range a little bit. Then you have your sprint attack, which is Sledgehammer. I mean, there's really not much to say about certain attacks here. They might just be very similar to what Odin's son has. Now, the signature attack that Odin's son has also returns with Mighty Thor here, and she obviously has the whirling cyclone here, which is just pretty much, as long as you're holding square, you hold square again, you hold square a third time, and it does a big whirlwind cyclone around her. This is really great. High impact, high stun, stagger and knockdown. Of course, if you have certain gear that works with the signature attack, you're going to be applying whatever that particular damage type is, which is pretty dope. You have the Starheart Slam, which if you're in the air, you just hold square and you do a slam with the hammer. That's a great attack. It's one that Thor has as well. The Slide Smash is when you push square or X immediately after dodging, and you do a quick sweep hammer attack there. And so this is great because it does spin the enemy around. Everything else is medium damage, medium impact, medium stun. Now looking at the heavy attacks, her heavy combo is somewhat similar to Odin's son. That's the hammer lunge right there. And you're just pressing triangle 3 times to essentially get that going. And then you have Sigurd's Strike, which is a little bit of a spin on Thor's same heavy attack. And as you can see, it kind of has this same idea of she's kind of doing these quick little mid-range throws with the hammer. And then she kind of finishes off the attack with that heavy hit, and that's very much how Odin's son finishes off the same combo. So it's a really great heavy attack. Of course, if you add R2 to it, just like Thor, you can just basically buff it with All-Mother's Blessing, which for Thor, his version is called Odin Force, whereas Mighty Thor, we're calling the Odin Force All-Mother's Blessing. Just as a quick turn of phrase, it just makes it a little different. Storm Striker is the power attack. Both Thors have this. So yeah, just holding triangle to do an overhead hammer attack. And then of course, if you add R2 to it, it's going to infuse it with All-Mother's Blessing, as long as you have All-Mother's Blessing to spend, Then you have Falling Star, another attack that Odin's son has as well. It's done by holding triangle in the air, and you notice you kind of come down at an angle. So you can also aim that attack too if you want to sort of like hold L2 to sort of orient your character and aim in a particular direction, and then start holding triangle. There you go. And then of course, if you hold R2 while doing Falling Star, of course you can do the All-Mother's Blessing to infuse the attack and do more damage with Falling Star. Okay, So on to the hammer here. Of course, you can hold L2 and press R2 to throw the hammer, much as you would as Odin's son. Here, you can trap up to 2 enemies beneath the hammer's immovable might. So that just means, that you can pin 2 enemies with the hammer. After performing Mjolnir's fight, you can press R2 as the hammer is returning to let loose a powerful combo throw. So quickfire, this is actually one of the most powerful tools in the kit for Mighty Thor that makes her unique. This is not some separate skill that you equip. This is just a default part of how she utilizes the hammer. And so essentially what this does is it lets you do a ranged combo finisher, which when Thor throws the hammer, he really just throws it, calls it back, throws it, calls it back. But here, you're literally doing a combo because the first throw is different. That's your standard throw. But then the second throw, she sort of gives it a little swing before she throws it, and it deals a little bit more of an impact. So you can do a lot of damage with this, and it's not hard to pull off. So keep quickfire in mind when you're throwing the hammer. Now, also another part of her kit that makes her very unique, Thor can equip this in his mastery section, I believe. He can equip something similar to this. But this is just part of Mighty Thor's kit. This is something that you simply just unlock with a skill point, and it's always there. You don't have to make choices between, do I want this or do I want something else? So that's, once again, this is something that makes Mighty Thor seem more powerful and more special and have certainly more choices here. So she's able to mark enemies here. So she's able to mark these 3 enemies. And of course, when you let go of R2, she's going to just throw the hammer and it's going to bounce off of all the enemies. Now, this one is interesting. This is also another move that she has called Seek and Pin. So performing Seeking Mjolnir without marking any targets will evoke the weapon to seek out an enemy in sight and pin them. So if you're just holding R2 while holding L2, right, and you don't mark enemies, as we showed here, the hammer's just gonna go do its own thing and find something to hit. That's pretty cool. Because sometimes you might find yourself in duress, you're trying to aim at a bunch of enemies, and then you realize, oh crap, I don't have enough time. You just let the hammer loose, and it's going to find something to hit. The hammer, especially in Mighty Thor's build, it very much has a mind of its own. And then, of course, here we can upgrade the Seeking Mjolnir to 5, which this is really fun and really powerful, and you can quickly send 5 enemies to the ground, or you can completely destroy them, depending on what their status is. And then, of course, you got Drop the Uru, which after the hammer's thrown, you call it back, you press triangle, and it recalls the hammer, and you basically do an uppercut. And that will launch the enemy. So it's another thing that both Thors have. Certainly a good move. And then, of course, holding square when you don't have the hammer in your hands, rather than doing the headbutt that Odin's son does, Mighty Thor does the thunder kick, which I think is really cool. It's kind of a nice spin, and it's a lot of fun, and it looks great. It knocks back the enemy, and it's a very high impact guard break attack. All right. Crashing Thunder, this is another move that both of the Thors have. When you don't have the hammer with you, if you press triangle while sprinting, you recall the hammer, and then you just kind of slam it into the ground, launching enemies into the air. Alright, so now, getting into her intrinsic ability, All-Mother's Blessing, this is kind of what takes the place of Odin's Force. It's very similar. So, holding R2, you activate All-Mother's Blessing, the divine power that harnesses lightning to counter incoming attacks, but drains intrinsic All-Mother's Blessing energy. Does not counter unblockable attacks. So yeah, once again, if somebody's coming at you with an unblockable attack, you should probably dodge. The available charge of All-Mother's Blessing builds while not in use. Counter just before an attack hits to parry the attack, lowering the impact resistance of the attacker. So, pretty straightforward there. Goddess of Thunder here. This is the upgrade that boosts the strength of all melee attacks with an electrical charge that applies shock damage to targets and interrupts enemy attacks. So, I mean, there is certainly a case to be made here that you could do an unarmed build with some of the Thors, and you will see how I utilize somewhat of an unarmed build with this character at times. Galvanize here, this is just an ability to block grenades and projectiles. You can deflect them by simply just pulling R2 at the right time. You know, you're just, as soon as the projectiles hit, there you go. Activating All Mother's Blessing while the hammer is pinned to an enemy or the world radiates a periodic electrical pulse. So you're going to see a little bit of lightning come down, channel it into the hammer there. And it deals damage to the pinned enemy and, of course, to nearby enemies. Foster's Legacy is an intrinsic ability upgrade here. And while All Mother's Blessing is active, attacking and defeating enemies will refund intrinsic energy, keeping All Mother's Blessing active for a longer period of time. So melee attacks restore 2 points, and defeating enemies will restore 15 points. So obviously, if you're able to throw the hammer, channel All Mother's Blessing, and quickly defeat a bunch of enemies and do melee attacks and stuff all at once, you're probably going to do quite well and regenerate that energy and keep the electricity flowing here. Eternal Spark reduces the decay rate of intrinsic All Mother's Blessing energy by 15% when the ability is used continuously. That's great. Increases the max amount of intrinsic All Mother's Blessing energy by 25%. Cool. Now this is what I have pretty much based almost the entire build on, is the god Tempest. This is one of the greatest parts of her intrinsic ability. Dealing melee damage, which means not throwing the hammer, but just, doing little melee combos. Maybe the hammer's in your hand, maybe it's not. Builds up the overcharge meter. Filling the meter unleashes a shockwave that staggers nearby enemies while summoning additional shockwaves on thrown weapon attacks. The God Tempest buff increases all thrown weapon damage done by 15% for 10 seconds. Now that may sound like a short period of time, but basically what you do is you hit a couple enemies with some melee attacks. This buff procs, and you'll see it on the left side of the screen. It'll say like God Tempest, active, and it'll show a countdown timer or whatever. And you can start throwing the weapon and dealing massive damage. Now, taking damage will reduce the intrinsic meter. The amount lost is based on the strength of the attack. This does medium damage, high impact, medium stun, and, of course, staggers enemies. So this is great. I can use this to take out an adaptoid or something very, very quickly. I can deal lots of damage. I can knock back enemies and cause them a lot of trouble and make it difficult for them to fight back. And of course, electricity, the shock damage is happening everywhere. Triggering God Tempest instantly restores 25% of the intrinsic meter. While God Tempest is active, increased stun damage of thrown weapon attacks by 25%. So obviously you're going to be able to stun enemies really quick, which leads to more takedowns, which, if you know the builds I like to make, that leads to more heroic orbs. When overcharged, supercharge lightning bolts when countering enemy attacks. So once again, it just gives you so much power. And it really makes you feel incredibly powerful and like you're channeling that energy into the hammer. Alright, so going on to our specialty tree, we have Warrior's Fury, which is, same as Thor. We have God Blast, which is the same as Thor, but we're going to look deeper into both of these, okay? So the cool thing about Warrior's Fury is that if you have both Thors on your team and somebody pops this, it essentially gives it to the whole team, right? And you can choose what you want to equip onto this support heroic ability, and we'll look at that here in a second. So it supercharges All-Mother's Blessing beyond its normal limits. So we've looked at the intrinsic ability of what All-Mother's Blessing is. So essentially buffing that and making it stronger. Really great. Okay, the next part, we increase it by 2 seconds. Great. Now this is what I've chosen, is Emir's Wrath. Nearby teammates receive a temporary damage boost of 25% when Warrior's Fury is active. Now, you can do that, or you can revive nearby down teammates. You know, if you have buddies that are going down quite a bit, this can be an easy way to just quickly get them back in the action without having to walk over to them. Now, you could also do Yggdrasil's Blessing, which nearby teammates recover 10% willpower every 3 seconds. So, you know, you can very much sort of ease into sort of a healer type thing, but most of the time I feel like I can get to my teammates and I don't feel like I need to heal them remotely. And obviously if I'm buffing damage, so that's just making our team even more powerful. Now on the other side here, I'm also using Asgard's Fortune. Enemies defeated while Warrior's Fury is active has a 50% chance to drop a heroic orb. Of course, you can increase your critical attack damage, which, you know, I could very easily see myself switching to that if I feel like the abundance of heroic orbs is too much and I'm not benefiting because my heroics are coming back so fast that it's like, wow, do I even need the like 5 or 10 orbs that are in the environment, either generated by myself or by my teammates? You could certainly choose this, and depending on your build, you know, it could be helpful. So critical attack damage by 25%, critical attack chance by 10% of anyone affected by Warrior's Fury. So you got a Black Widow on your team, she's getting headshots or whatever, you are just further increasing her damage, right? Or another Thor throwing their hammer, all right? Yggdrasil's Favor here, nearby teammates receive an intermittent intrinsic energy boost of 20% while Warrior's Fury is active. Once again, these are judgment calls that you will be able to make on your character, but just understanding what it does. I mean, the fact here that you could refill someone's intrinsic energy, for example, Iron Man, you could essentially just fill up his bar, and then he would be able to just unleash more lasers, more missiles, repulsor blasts, whatever it is. That kind of dictates how much ammo he has, right? So that's pretty cool. All right, the Assault Heroic, this is one that Odin's Son has as well. God Blast is really great. Lifts the enemies in the air, blasts them with a powerful bolt of God-powered lightning that inflicts shock damage. So your first choice here is that you could hold up to 3 charges of God Blast. The ability charges faster than normal, but the enemies are not lifted into the air. So it's literally just the blast. It's right to business. It doesn't sort of give you this whirlwind and this extra time, you know, maybe to revive teammates or to allow your teammates to maybe also damage the enemies. I always tend to go with something like this. I like the whirlwind, which inflicts 20% more damage and applies cryo damage to targets caught in the swirling vortexes. So the good thing about that is, you know, it's applying cryo, which essentially what cryo does is it almost applies a slow motion effect to the enemies that are affected by that. You'll sort of see sort of this cryo, almost kind of a mist around them. And it's really great. That slow motion can give you an advantage, right? Enemies caught in the God Blast Whirlwind have a 33% chance to drop regen packs. So once again, if health is a concern to you, then this is a selection that you can make. If you feel like you want to use God Blast more and more and more, then you can certainly do that. But I think, in my opinion, I just like the cryo boost. You know, I'm doing shock damage. It's cool to have cryo as well. And I think we're going to see more reasons with my gear set and skill tree choices that will further reinforce this. Hitting 5 enemies with a single God Blast activates and overcharges All Mother's Blessing. That's great. So as long as you're finding yourself a crowd with which to use your Assault Heroic against, you're going to overcharge and be able to instantly go into that. Increases the amount of shock damage inflicted by the God Blast. That's great. Now, on this end, God Blast inflicts 15% increased normal and stun damage against shocked enemies. So that's great. That's certainly a good thing. Overexposure is maybe a choice that you would look at, and maybe something you would like. But what I have chosen is that God Blast inflicts 20% increased damage when triggered while overcharged. Because I'm pretty consistently overcharged, and when I have my overcharge, I pretty much decide to go to town. I throw up, Warrior's Fury, I throw up God Blast, and I just go to town. I start throwing the hammer, I start doing signature attacks, combos, whatever I need to do to get the job done. So if I just want the overall damage boost, I can go with this, but, to get that extra 5% there, when I'm overcharged, and I'm overcharged a lot, it's a perk that I've chosen. So sometimes you have to choose. Do you want something that's more of a long-term thing that you're going to be able to do all the time, or do you want an extra boost that you can only use at a certain period of time, right? Then here, you've got Rolling Thunder. Defeating enemies with God Blast refunds 5% of Assault Heroic energy. I'm not really concerned about getting the energy back. It really, with the Heroic Orbs that are dropping by myself and my teammates, I'm not concerned. So now, getting into the ultimate Heroic ability, and this one is a lot of fun. Take a look. So, by starting up the ultimate Heroic ability, you end up throwing Mjolnir out, and it automatically seeks targets. So once again, Mjolnir kind of has a mind of its own here. Very much like Hawkair's Hunter Arrow, it's just going to automatically go out there and seek targets. This is very powerful. It can hit targets up to 10 times before returning, while active summon Underjarn for melee and ranged attacks and reduce all damage taken by 20%. Okay? So you're basically reducing damage taken, and you're also able to utilize Underjarn for melee and ranged attacks. So it essentially, you're summoning this other weapon to replace Mjolnir while it goes around and just does damage. So this is great. It has a duration of 20 seconds, breaks block, high damage, high impact, high stun, and knocks back enemies. These are all great things. Now, a couple other things you do. You can upgrade it, increase the damage of Underjarn by 20%, then increase the duration of the all weapon by 10 seconds. So now that's put you at a whopping 30 seconds, so you're able to utilize this. Now, you can choose, if you want, Seek True. Increasing the damage of Mjolnir by 20% and the speed at which Mjolnir seeks out and hits targets. Pretty great thing. But what I have chosen is that every time Mjolnir hits a target, a bolt of lightning strikes the hammer that shocks the target and hits nearby enemies. So you can see this. Every time the hammer is hitting one of these aimbots here, you see a lightning strike from above come down. And that can be very powerful. That can prevent enemies from rushing in and getting towards you. So if you want that extra damage, if you're really looking to just kill things, that's great. But sometimes I'm looking for a little bit of situational control. Sometimes I'm looking to apply the shock effect to multiple targets, right? And then over here you have Mjolnir orbits Jane instead of seeking out targets. So this sort of acts more like a shield. And essentially, I mean, it kind of counts as a combo here. Because you can notice while Jane is doing her melee attacks here, the hammer is also meleeing these enemies. And so it's like you're staggering and doing lots of damage there. So I think this is really powerful if you just need more armor or more attacks. And you're not really concerned about the situation. You're more concerned about protecting yourself. So sometimes there are sort of, I would say this is like a selfish choice that you can make. You can either do things that benefit the team as a whole, or you can do things that kind of benefit you. And this is one of those examples. And it's not a bad choice to make. I'm not demeaning it at all. I mean, I just see it as a choice that, hey, this benefits me. This is good for solo players. This is, it's good for a variety of situations, and it's kind of nice to have. Now we have this one, We Are Hell. Enemies struck by Mjolnir have a 50% chance to drop a regen pack. Enemies defeated by Mjolnir drop a regen pack. So, pretty high chance of dropping lots of regen packs if staying alive and healing your teammates is something you're concerned with. Dealing damage with Undyarn builds up the overcharge meter 25% faster. So, I do like this. I do think Undyarn's bark is certainly something worthy of being equipped, because once again, this whole build is kind of built around the overcharge meter. But the reason I went with Undyarn's Bite is just because I want that extra 30% chance when enemies are defeated to drop a heroic orb. But I could very easily see switching between these. It's none of this stuff is set in stone. Like I could literally load up into a different activity and be like, oh, I'm doing a raid right now. Let me switch up a few things on the skill tree. Nothing's set in stone. Of course, my Thor can fly. The Beam of Starfire is also available. You just hold R2 while you're sprint flying, as it were. And it does drain your Allmother's Blessing energy, but once again, it's just one of those awesome things that's part of the Thor's kits that is just as powerful as Iron Man's lasers and very viable. I love having it. Illusion, just letting you know that this is your evasion ability. Just press circle to dodge, pretty much. Ascension, holding circle when near an enemy, you can vault over them. Every Avenger has sort of a vault ability here. So, once again, just seeing what that is here. Alright, now we're on to the Mastery Tree. This is where things are going to get interesting. So, I've chosen melee stun damage, increased by 15%. But you do have the option to increase the impact of signature attacks. You do have the ability to increase the damage of all power attacks as well. This really just depends on what you're trying to do. So since I like my signature attacks to build up stun damage, and a lot of stuff in the kit can build up stun damage so that I can do takedowns, so I can get heroic orbs very easily, which might allow me to simply make the decision here, okay, well, maybe I don't need that chance to have Undyarn generate the heroic orbs. Maybe I just need more overcharge meter. I can go back and forth and make these decisions here. And obviously, if you have gear that sort of says, oh, hey, your signature attacks deal vibranium damage, or oh, hey, your power attacks deal vibranium damage, maybe you want to focus your entire build. You might want to shift. So the Mastery Tree, once again, these are settings that I won't sit here and tell you that I have the best settings in the world or that anyone does. Nothing's set in stone because you want to modify it with what you have here. So obviously right here I've got light combo finishers and melee power attacks. So it would make sense for me to go here and potentially increase the damage by 15% right there. But I like having some stun damage. Increased damage from unarmed attacks by 15%. Now, I already have some gear in my build, actually, that's going to increase damage from unarmed attacks. I can briefly switch to that right there. 30% increased damage from unarmed attacks on my belt here. So, I could potentially, stack it and make it more. But I'm not like a big unarmed attack person. So I like having the option there. I like that the attacks already do a lot of damage, and I like the potential I could do more. Critical Juggler increases the critical attack chance when air juggling enemies by 15%. I'm just not much for juggling enemies in the air, so I don't utilize that. Now, increased damage from combo finishers by 15%. This is something I will switch between. Sometimes I might want the unarmed attacks, especially with the way the build is right now. But I'm also doing a lot of combo finishers. The light combo finisher is very good. And as you can see earlier on my gauntlets here, I have light combo finishers, which is just pressing square a couple of times does the vibranium damage. So I've chosen combo finishers to get more damage. Okay. Performing a takedown drops regen, or you can have it drop an intrinsic orb, or you can have it drop a heroic orb. I usually opt for heroic orb with every character, I know. Unless I'm going for like a special build where I want intrinsic more often, which I feel like it doesn't take long for the intrinsic mirror to just naturally fill up with my standard gameplay style with Mighty Thor. So I'm more worried most of the time about just making sure I always have my heroics. And so I can always switch off that, and I can say, oh hey, I'd like to have my intrinsic quicker so I can do God Tempest even quicker. Okay, so getting into the ranged mastery tree, this is increasing the targeting range on hammer recalls to ensure it always hits a target when recalled. I love this. I personally think it's great. It's an automatic thing that when you just press R2 to call the hammer back to you, it's just going to ping pong off some enemies before it gets in your hand here. You could also set the Seeking Mjolnir from 5 when it's fully upgraded to adding an extra 2 targets hit there, so that would make it a +7. So if you really want to do the lock-on thing and lock on to 7 enemies and throw the hammer out, that's great. More power to you. But a lot of the times I think 5 is enough. That's just my opinion. Untargeted range power attacks will attempt to seek out a second enemy to pin. So that's certainly an option. I just don't see it as like an incredibly powerful choice. I think hitting a lot of enemies with little to no effort is my favorite way to go there. Critical return increases the chance that the hammer will inflict critical attacks on the return flight. Now this goes quite hand in hand with the targeting range here. And of course, if we're always trying to aim for crits, that's a great choice to make. Increasing the hammer throw and recall speed by 15%. This just makes, throwing and calling it back faster, which is great. But I've always sort of used both of the Thor's hammers. I've preferred the guard breaker. I prefer that just a weak toss, just a regular, hold L2, press R2 to break through shields. That's great. You can also alternatively hold R2 and do the power toss, and then you wouldn't have to equip guard breaker. You could potentially come over here and say, oh, I want to throw my hammers faster, or oh hey, I would prefer to have more critical attacks on the return flight. So once again, this stuff is not set in stone, and I can very easily change these. And obviously with God Tempest, with a lot of other things working for me, critical attacks are incredibly powerful. And I already feel like she sort of, because she has that ranged combo throw, that she is able, the quickfire, that she is able to throw her hammer seemingly faster than Thor. And this may be by just milliseconds here, but, this is just where we are. Okay, so increases the damage of Beam of Starfire, which we said that's the laser beam that you fire with R2 while you're sprint flying. I like that. I like that to be very powerful. You could reduce the intrinsic energy cost of the Beam of Starfire by 15%. That's certainly a good thing, but I am never worried. I feel like the intrinsic bar regenerates in a timely manner. I'm never worried about having enough ammo, because really you're just going to be using the laser beams if you're doing anti-air stuff or you're flying up close to an enemy, and then once you get to the enemy, you're either going to start punching them or you're going to start throwing the hammer around. You're probably not just going to you're not just going to fly around and do laser beams all day, is my thinking. Flying shots, press circle while flying to shoot out bolts of lightning at nearby targets. Slowly drains the intrinsic All-Mother's Blessing energy. This is cool too. It's just an option that it almost seems like you're just trying to have a variety of different attacks while you're flying around, and to me it's unnecessary. I just think making Beam of Starfire more powerful is the best option. All right, so getting into the intrinsic ability, I like this. I like ionic bolts. Defeating enemies while All Mother's Blessing is active strikes nearby targets with lightning. So obviously, they're just sort of showcasing this by doing her light combo finisher while pressing R2, and then we're seeing all these lightning strikes coming down. Force of Will, dealing damage while All Mother's Blessing is active, will recover 1.2% willpower per hit. So once again, that could be very powerful, but once again, I am not concerned about my willpower, which is my health, right? Defeating enemies while All Mother's Blessing is active has a 25% chance to generate regen packs. So once again, great thing to have. Generating health is always a good thing. But once again, I just think the ionic bolts give you so many more, potential options here. The enemies are having these lightning strikes, these sort of shock waves that are taking place. They're preventing these enemies from being able to hurt you and deal damage to you and your teammates. Plus, you look really cool because lightning's everywhere. Let's see. Reduces the overall energy cost of using intrinsic All Mother's Blessing ability by 10%. So, reducing the cost, great, cool. Performing a perfect dodge grants 30 points of intrinsic All Mother's Blessing energy. This is great because that can fill it up very rapidly. And, of course, a perfect dodge, you're just timing that dodge at the very last second, and you press circle or B to do that. Surging Force increases the automatic regeneration speed of intrinsic All Mother's Blessing energy by 12%. So I do that so that I don't really have to rely on perfect dodges. I do perfect dodges all the time. It's great. It's fun. But I've just chosen to sort of, hey, it would be great if this was regenerating on its own all the time when I'm not doing stuff, or even if I am attacking people, it can just quickly come back. Reduces the intrinsic All Mother's Blessing energy penalty incurred when failing to counter against strong or unblockable attacks. So, if I miss a dodge or a counter or something, then this is great. But I'm trying to learn to be better and try to dodge more often, try to counter more often. So I don't equip this because I see it sort of as a crutch. Now, I'm not saying anything demeaning here. It's just personally to me, I am trying to, and you could say that this is hard mode here, that I'm not equipping something here that allows me to, potentially ease my suffering a little bit here. But I'm just trying to learn to spot counters and dodges better and try to react better to the multiple stimuli in the environment. And then, of course, you can see I've chosen Charged Flight, which extended flight generates an electrical charge that's dispersed in an energy explosion on impact. So basically, both Thors have this. If you're sprint flying, you'll start to see, sort of some lightning form up on your character. And then once you sort of dive bomb into the ground or whatever, you can just create an energy explosion on the enemies. It's really great. My favorite way to enter a fight. Speed burst is also great. Holding X to quickly accelerate forward. Of course, it's going to burn your All Mother's Blessing, your intrinsic energy. But yeah, it's just a choice. I just like having that extra shockwave that I can deal right there on impact when I land. But obviously, if you're trying to do something like the Wakanda raid and you're trying to speed through and fly really quickly through puzzles and stuff, Iron Man and Thor's both have this sort of speed burst attack here. All right. Looking at the intrinsic stuff, reduces the amount of overcharge energy drained when taking damage by 20%. That's great. Increases the duration of God's Tempest by 3 seconds. That's great too. So this is another one where it just comes down to personal preference, right? It seems like my whole build is built around God Tempest, but I've chosen here to increase the damage of all thrown weapon attacks by 10% and the damage of the shockwaves by 15% during the God Tempest. So we know that there's shockwaves happening during God Tempest, so I'm choosing to buff the damage of that as well. Okay. So, would it be helpful to have an extra 3 seconds? Sure. But it's even better to deal more damage consistently and especially while God Tempest is happening. Okay, so next one. Tempest Recharge. Triggering God Tempest instantly refills the intrinsic meter and increases intrinsic regen by 25%. So this is great. I like Tempest Recharge quite a bit because once I get God Tempest and I start throwing the hammer like a madman and dealing lots of damage, it just fills up, and then I can just keep doing more damage. So it makes Mighty Thor incredibly powerful. Tempest Stun. While God Tempest is active, increased stun damage of the thrown weapon weak point attacks by 25%. Certainly a good thing to do if you're really wanting to build up stun damage and maybe get takedowns or whatever, which certainly a lot of my builds are about that, but in this particular instance, I'm really just wanting to make sure I have my intrinsic full at all times and my heroics full at all times. Increases the force of the shockwaves on thrown weapon attacks, making them more likely to interrupt targets. Once again, it's certainly a good choice to have, but once again, I just opted here to fill the intrinsic meter. But if you are fighting a lot of heavy enemies and a lot of enemies that you would want to interrupt their unblockable attacks and such, you would probably want to have stuff like this. So I don't know, maybe you would want to have different builds for different activities or base things around whatever type of enemy you're going to fight. Goddess Shield reduces damage taken by 15% while God Tempest is active. Certainly a good thing to have. And you also have Goddess Fist. Melee attack damage is increased by 15% while God Tempest is active. But you're gonna be throwing the hammer, is my point. When God Tempest is active, it really makes sense to throw the hammer. So I opted for Goddess Force, which increases the force of the shockwaves when triggering God Tempest, making them more likely to interrupt targets. High damage, high impact, flyback. And then you just start throwing the hammer. Hammer does more damage while thrown. And then, once you run out of God Tempest, go back to doing melee attacks. And then you can get back into throwing the hammer around some more. So that's kind of what I have in terms of the skill tree and what I like to do on my character. So let's look at some other options that we have with our character now. All right, so let's take a look at gear. And I do have quite a bit of options that we can look at in terms of gear. But what I'm using right now, this has light combo finishers, melee power attacks are dealing vibranium damage. Of course, I have other options here. On the right is the gear that I have equipped. On the left is sort of a comparison here. This one has the option for signature attacks to deal vibranium damage. This one here, kind of the same gear, except for this one does sonic damage. This one right here is pretty much identical, but the first perk is a little different. So it has to do with the sonic conduit stuff, which is part of raid gear or corrupted vibranium event gear, which also drops raid gear, which is pretty dope. And this here has the same light combo finishers, melee power attacks, deal sonic damage. So I like kind of having some different options here, and I'm certainly trying to build up a cryo option as well for melee stuff. But since I'm running the raid a lot and vibranium is just like really powerful and really fun, this is kind of my main choice that I've been using in terms of the melee gear slot. So going into ranged, the hammer, range power attacks, and attacks performed on pinned enemies deal vibranium damage. It's a great thing to have. Of course, I have a cosmic option. Of course, I have sonic options. And the great thing about this one is that it has 20% increased damage from hammer attacks. So I was using this for a good while because combine that with God Tempest and things get out of hand very quickly, right? Of course, you can have range critical attacks, activating vibranium payload. Sonic damage is certainly good. But the thing I like about my hammer here is that also pinning an enemy spreads the cryostasis effect to nearby enemies. So once again, there's several things in my build whether it's the assault heroic or whether it's the hammer itself. When I'm pinning someone, the cryostasis effect is happening, regardless of whether I've equipped gear here that's potentially, building up cryo when I'm doing a certain type of attack. So I'm getting 2 for the price of 1, essentially. So yeah, is it a little vibranium heavy? Yeah, but usually I would probably throw in something like this and do vibranium and sonic, just like mix things up or whatever I'm feeling at the time. All right, so the chest piece, what I've chosen for right now is 15% increased critical hit chance from hammer attacks, which, kind of ties into the fact that I'm going to be throwing the hammer a lot. God Tempest is going to be, a powerful force to be reckoned with, and as long as I'm either using the lock-on thing to get crits that way or just aiming the hammer carefully to get crits, it's fairly easy to get crits. And of course, we're getting crits on the return flight when we call the hammer back based on which skills we pick from the skill tree. Also reducing the intrinsic energy cost for suffering a guard break by 50%. So that's cool. If I get hit, my guard's broken or whatever, then I don't lose as much intrinsic energy. Obviously, having a different perk there could be better, but I like this for right now. Gained increased defense based on the amount of All-Mother's Blessing, which is our intrinsic energy built up to a maximum of 10%. So I'm getting extra defense, which is great. There are some other gear pieces, other perks that I'm quite fond of. This one's great. While overcharged, vaulting enemies deals shock damage. That's pretty cool. 2% increased willpower recovery when All-Mother's Blessing is active, which once again, this build is all about the intrinsic energy. It's about All-Mother's Blessing. It's about God Tempest. So anytime we see perks that involve All-Mother's Blessing, we should get a little excited. So generating additional All-Mother's Blessing energy when dealing damage and defeating enemies, that's great. With the all-weapon active, enemies struck by Mjolnir have a 30% chance to drop intrinsic orbs, so that's during your ultimate, right? Defeating an enemy while unarmed spreads the cryo effect. This is great. Increasing the duration of the all-weapon by 8.5 seconds. So I've certainly enjoyed this, but as you can see, it kind of lowers my ratings a little bit. But sometimes, the perks, these perks could outweigh some of the potential ratings declines. Sometimes you will just find that certain perks are just really good. In terms of other gear, in this slot, I think that's pretty much gets down to it. I mean, there's obviously other gear pieces there that are pretty neat, but let's go on to the belt here. So we've already looked at this. Acer's Breaker, 30% increased damage from unarmed attacks. So once again, I said I don't do unarmed builds with the Thors, but like this perk just happened to drop and it happens to be kind of dope. And you know what? There are times where you have enemies pinned by your hammer and you're going to throw out some unarmed attacks. And of course, you're going to be burning All-Mother's Blessing while you're doing unarmed attacks so you can do extra shock damage. The next perk, enemies defeated while Warrior's Fury is active, extends its duration 1.5 seconds. This is very powerful. So once again, Warrior's Fury was a support heroic, right? And we're doing that to buff our damage, right? Which, once we do that, it's the best thing to do when you're overwhelmed by enemies is pop Warrior's Fury, start throwing the hammer, start dealing melee damage, pin enemies, start doing unarmed attacks on them, whatever it takes. And then, of course, the great thing that I like here is activating an ultimate heroic on the ground creates a cryo hazard. So when I summon Undyarn and send Mjolnir out to automatically attack targets, there's going to be like a radius of cryo hazard around me. And it's really great because, once again, the cryo does what? It sort of provides sort of a slow-mo effect to the enemies and allows you to attack them and juggle them and have all sorts of fun, right? Now, some other options, you can increase willpower and heroic energy regen while overcharged, which once again, we're going to be overcharged a lot. The all-weapon is active. Defeating enemies with Mjolnir creates a shock explosion. That's great. Enemies hit with God Blast have a 30% chance to drop an intrinsic orb. So, I mean, there are some really great pieces of gear here with perks that are really great, whether it's the raid or you want an increased heroic charge rate when All Mother's Blessing is active. Once again, this one's quite cool. Unarmed attacks generate 15% more overcharge. That's great. Enemies with God Tempest defeated extends the duration of God Tempest. So that means while I'm throwing the hammer, I can just keep throwing the hammer around and keep maintaining God Tempest. So that's why I have this one padlocked, is because eventually I probably want to infuse some gear into this and take the God Tempest build even further. But I like my cryo hazard so much, and I like the extra time added on to Warrior's Fury. So I don't want to just spec into God Tempest alone. I want to make sure that there's multiple things I can do in my build that make me powerful. But this is certainly an option. That's obviously why it's padlocked. This one here is just pretty much the same thing, but it seems to have an 18% increase to the ranged rating, which I try not to spec too heavily into one or the other, because I do like playing melee, and obviously throwing the hammer is very powerful, but I also like having a high heroic rating, which 12k is pretty good right now, and I can obviously get it higher if I swap out different gear pieces. In terms of artifacts, I'm not doing anything super crazy, but I do have increased damage from gear perks by 200% on both of these. And so there are a lot of damage buffs that I can select on my various gear pieces there. So this can be very powerful. And then, of course, getting a 10% increase damage on power attacks, which I'm using to generate vibranium damage. Doing that all the time, whether I'm throwing the hammer or whether I'm just doing a melee attack, right? Getting that extra damage is helpful. Melee crit attacks, activating vibranium payload, that's great too. I've also just used the Kimoyo bead because since I'm going so heavy into vibranium and we're doing a lot of the Wakanda raid, it just kind of makes sense. But of course, you can obviously go with the Tactagon to sort of increase damage on any status effect. Because, I'm also doing cryo, I'm also doing shock damage, so it kind of makes sense to also use Tactagon. Obviously using this, if you think you need more heroic energy, I think this is a great way to be able to get it. And the others are just fine. There's obviously builds that you can create around different major artifacts, and I don't think you should freak out on one over the other. But anyway, that is a look at my gear. Obviously, what your gear might be may change your character a little bit, but just sort of making those connections of what perks are good and what perks work with a particular build, and what stuff kind of might round out your build and make it powerful in a different way. Certainly useful. Alright, so we're going to take a look at just, some general combat here with Mighty Thor. Obviously seeing how some of her attacks work, how you can trigger different things. Summon the hammer back. And even if I miss a throw, I can just pretty much summon it in here. And I can do God Blast. Instantly have God Tempest. And once again, it's just absolutely destroying enemies here. And the more crowded the situation is, the more powerful you're going to be. And then obviously, you can do the cryo on the ground, and then have Mjolnir seeking out targets. And utilizing Underjarn. go. So you can see that the meter is filling up on a pretty regular basis, and then obviously I've got God Tempest here. And you can see how it's just applying this shock all over the place, regardless of, you know, these enemies with shields. I'm just kind of throwing the hammer around semi-aimlessly. And obviously, look at all these heroic orbs. Look at all these regen packs. And I still have Warrior's Fury as long as there's enemies for me to damage. I'm generating more seconds of it. So obviously, I think Avengers just needs more overwhelming enemy encounters, right? And so obviously, you can see I can just chain into everything I want to do, and if I'm overwhelmed, I can quickly even the odds. And especially with all these guys in the air, you know, potentially dropping a bunch of missiles on me and stuff. And even if it's big enemies like this and I can only knock them down, I can still deal some really good damage. Take out the aerial threats. I can get takedowns when needed. And we're able to quickly clear multiple waves of enemies and have a lot of fun. And the signature attacks, once again, are always very powerful. So that's a look at the combat showcase. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos.